Hello, welcome back to Telling History Through Graphic Novels. I'm so excited about this discussion, which is sponsored generously by the Historic New Orleans Collection today. Before we get into today's discussion, though, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the real reason we're all here for these few days of words and music, because I actually haven't done that today. We are here at Words and Music because the funds raised here at Words and Music uplift our city year round. Words and Music is run by One Book, One New Orleans, which is a nonprofit focused on adult literacy and community. So we pick one book every year, and we encourage everyone in the city to read the same book at the same time, with the idea that we're going to grow stronger as a community through a shared reading experience. But in doing that, we have to recognize that the functional illiteracy rate among our adults in this city is much higher than the national average. So in order to really be One Book, One New Orleans, we have to do an extra layer of outreach to make sure that those folks who would normally be left out of a community of readers get brought into the fold. And we do that with a network of community partners. We develop a curriculum around the book every year, and we get that book and its curriculum into the hands of adult education programs throughout the city. Adults who are low literate, adults preparing for their high set, adults who are in ESL programs, also incarcerated adults and teens are all using our book and the curriculum to improve their literacy skills. We also get the book into the ears of the blind and print handicapped through a partnership with WRBH Reading Radio. And we get the book into the hands of readers who may love to read but may not be able to afford their own books by making sure that every copy of the New Orleans Public Library, every branch of the New Orleans Public Library has a few copies. When it's non-pandemic times, we have a series of free family-friendly events focused on the book. Right now, they're all on YouTube. You can go to our YouTube channel, which many of you are watching from right now, and you can view all of the events since April 2020 for free. I hope you enjoy them. We're also really excited in 2021 to have a new partnership with the Historic New Orleans Collection, which is really dedicated to helping get their publications into the hands of some of the folks that we serve. And one of those publications is a book called Monumental by Brian K. Mitchell. It's a graphic novel telling the history of Oscar Dunn. And here to tell us a little bit more about the Historic New Orleans Collection and about Monumental is Monumental's editor, Nick Weldon, who will be moderating today. Take it away, Nick.
Thanks, Megan. Hi, everybody. I'll try to keep this introduction brief so we can get to our really exciting conversation tonight. But like Megan said, I'm Nick Weldon. I'm an editor at the Historic New Orleans Collection, and I'll be moderating our session tonight. I just wanted to share a little bit about the Historic New Orleans Collection. We're a history museum dedicated to the city, the state, and the Gulf South region. We have 3 locations in the French Quarter, and as a history museum, the collection not only produces exhibitions, but we're also a repository for historical materials and a publisher of carefully researched nonfiction. We're also a free resource. Admission is free, our research center is free to visit, and you can access our online catalog and educational resources for free as well. All of these efforts are designed to further our understanding of the people, places, events, and circumstances that have contributed to our city, culture, and communities today. So you can check us out at hnoc.org. You can wander in the next time you're in the French Quarter, look for our books at your local bookstore or library, and follow us on social media. So thanks, Megan, and the Words and Music Festival organizers, board, and supporters for this opportunity. And let's get started. I want to introduce our panelists here. So we have Hugo Martinez, who was the illustrator of Wake, The Hidden History of Women-Led Slave Revolts, which came out this year. And Hugo is a freelance illustrator and comic book artist living in New Orleans. He graduated from the Watkins College of Art and Design with a BFA in graphic design. He is a first-generation U.S. citizen, and his work revolves around issues of race, justice, identity, and community. We have Josh Neufeld, who is the author and illustrator of AD, New Orleans After the Deluge. Josh is a cartoonist known for his nonfiction narratives of political and social upheaval, told through the voices of witnesses. He's the writer and artist of the nonfiction graphic novel AD, like I said, and A Few Perfect Hours. His other works include The Influencing Machine, The Vagabonds, Keyhole, and numerous nonfiction comics for various news outlets. Neufeld has been a Knight Wallace Fellow in Journalism, an Atlantic Center for the Arts Master Artist, and a Xeric Award winner. He lives in Brooklyn, New York, where he makes and teaches comics, including at the School of Visual Art. He's also the illustrator. I read that already. And then lastly, I want to introduce my collaborator on Monumental, the author of Monumental, Brian Keith Mitchell, who is a native of New Orleans and a resident of North Little Rock, Arkansas. Brian identifies himself as a transplanted New Orleanian who is forever thankful to the state of Arkansas for welcoming him during the chaotic aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Brian is currently an associate professor of history at the University of Arkansas Little Rock and an associate faculty member at the Anderson Institute on Race and Ethnicity. He's a graduate of the University of New Orleans and Monumental. Oscar Dunn, his radical fight in Reconstruction Louisiana, was the winner of a 2021 Phyllis Wheatley Award and Louisiana's selection for the Library of Congress's Great Reads from Great Places list. All that out of the way now, I want to open it up to our awesome panel tonight. Hi, everybody. And I want to start, maybe we'll start with Hugo and rotate around, but to open things up, I want to ask y'all, what do you think makes the graphic novel format an effective medium for nonfiction storytelling? Because we're all familiar with Marvel, DC, et cetera, and kind of the fictional worlds, but we have all worked in this media for nonfiction storytelling. And maybe Hugo, you can get us started here.
What a huge question.
No pressure.
It's a real honor to just to be here with everybody and just the admirable work that everybody's done. So, I mean, I think I just have to start with my own experience reading graphic novels. I've gotten to see Joe Sacco's work, which is not exactly historical graphic novels, but, they're journalistic and they can, just hone in onto an aspect of telling a narrative that gives you perspective in a way that, like film and other media don't quite do. You can sit with the medium and look really closely at it for however long you like, or, however quickly you like. And I think that gives a lot of depth to the work because you can hold it, you can look at it. There's probably tons to be said about why it can be an effective medium for telling history or showing history. But I think for me, that's one of those aspects.
Yeah, I would.
Maybe Josh, you can. Yeah.
I would follow up by also giving a shout out to Joe Sacco because he's been such a huge influence from myself in the world of comics journalism. And yes, thank you for inviting me to be part of this group. And it's a real honor to be sharing the stage with both of you guys. But I also, adding on to what Hugo said, I would quote Scott McCloud, author of Understanding Comics, who talks about how comics, because they have this stripped down, kind of boiled down, focus on the contour line and this ability to sort of create these characters that I think people of all sorts of different backgrounds can identify with. And I think we're used to that from growing up reading superhero comics and other types of fantasy stories where we project ourselves into these adventures and feel like they're happening to us. I think when you use that same power of comics to transport yourself into the viewpoint of the protagonist of these nonfiction stories, I think it enables you to connect and form empathic relationships with these people and really feel what they're feeling in a way that's really deep and maybe more immersive than some other forms of storytelling. So I think that's kind of like what I always plug into. And as an author, I think about that a lot. Like, how can I really, make the reader feel what these characters have gone through?
I agree with Josh and both with Hugo. Most of us are brought to reading visually. We start with the picture books and we're immersed in those images and we learn the words alongside those images. And then we move on to comic books. And for most of us, it's a vehicle that we're really comfortable with seeing. And it allows, for me, I talk about a lot of racialized violence. It allows people to see racialized violence without immediately turning away or being by not understand, but they will understand the images. So it creates a universal platform that I think a lot of people are more receptive to than the written word all the time.
And Brian, you brought up something that really all three of these books have in common, which is that they deal with some serious, real subject matter. I mean, AD is all about the trauma of Katrina, and Wake is about slavery and racism and the experiences that Rebecca Hall had just trying to make this book. And Brian, of course, this book is Monumental, all about, the fight for civil rights during Reconstruction and the white supremacist violent backlash to all of that progress made. And so, when you think of illustrated books, you maybe are not thinking about these sort of serious topics being covered. So maybe you all can talk about, how you approach sensitive issues in order to be authentic, but also understanding that, younger readers that don't know a lot about these subjects are going to pick this up and maybe could be triggered by some of the information or just not be equipped to dive right in. And so there's a sensitivity in the approach that we all had to have in making these books, right?
Sure. I mean, I'll jump in. That was something that my book came out more than 10 years ago, and I think there was a little bit less of a groundwork that had been laid for graphic narratives and on serious topics. Maybe there were amazing books of nonfiction that had already been out, but it wasn't quite as saturated a marketplace as I think it is now. And I think audiences are much more prepared for the idea that a comic book could also be serious and deal with real issues and violence and racism and disturbing images and experiences. And I think just the way that, we think about that before we watch a TV show or a movie or listen to a radio drama, I mean, not a drama, but like a piece of nonfiction on the radio. It's good to maybe put out a trigger warning, but at the same time, I don't shy away from those kinds of portrayals. I think it's actually really important to tell the truth and to speak truth. And, there were some things that happened in AD that I documented that happened to the real characters in there that were not what the narrative, the prevailing narrative was at that time, that was sort of refuting fake news that was going on about who perpetuated violence at the convention center and rapes and things like that. And so, I didn't even for a second consider censoring what I felt was important to say, or that the people whose voices I was translating were talking about. There were children, when I was first coming out with the book, there were parents who were picking up the book and talking about giving it to their 11 or 12-year-old child. And I was like, well, just so you know, there's some pretty coarse language in there. There's also like a dead child that's shown. And the 99% of the parents were like, oh, my kids have seen much worse than that already. Don't worry about it. So that was kind of where I came down on it at that point. I still kind of feel that way about my work.
I feel that my work was necessary and timely. And it isn't. A lot of people ask, you must have been very prophetic to see all these political things happening on the horizon and seeing the January insurrection and seeing the polarization. And it's not so much that. It's Reconstruction was a period of time which in my day wasn't taught in elementary school, wasn't taught very much in high school. But it helped me understand the world that we live in today. And I think it's important that children have that sort of access. Right now is a scary time to be growing up in. There's the uncertainty of political violence on the horizon. There's racialized violence that's happening all around the country. And it's important that children and adults know that this happened before and we made it through it. And we can learn from the mistakes that happen during Reconstruction, and we don't have to make those mistakes again. And I'm hoping that it's more a cautionary tale, and it shows people a lot of hope and promise that we had, and because of who Dunn was, we overlooked him. We just passed him by. And maybe the present that we live in today might have been entirely different had we taken a different path in the 1870s.
I think for me, the experience was a bit different. I didn't write Wake. I collaborated with Dr. Rebecca Hall, and I think it was very much a dialogue. And so I think maybe in some ways I had to be a bit of a I had to kind of filter through how to depict certain moments of violence and of history, and I think. There were moments that needed to be expressed with tact, and I think it was important to not have a perspective that, I don't know. It's hard to really express. Just I just know that there were ways that certain things should be depicted. I think we should be able to see that there is racialized violence, but we should not use that imagery to glorify that type of violence, or to take away the dignity of the individuals that were recipients of that violence, and I think those are things that I hope that I did to in effect that communicates, that didn't distract from the message that Wake wanted to get across.
And you're dealing with, Wake is such an interesting book because it's a past and present story. It's dealing with stuff that happened hundreds of years ago, but it's also the story of Rebecca's contemporary search for these individuals and their stories. And as the illustrator, and then Brian and Josh, y'all can talk a little bit about your reference points. But I'm very curious, again, this being nonfiction, this is not something that can entirely come out of your brain. You have to have reference material, whether it's written, whether it's visual. There's a fidelity that you want to keep to the facts and the primary sources at your disposal. So I'm curious, Hugo, if I can come back to you, just how much latitude you were given creatively when you're illustrating this book, and what kind of materials you had to reference, because especially some of these older 1600s, 1700s, there's not like photographs, like you just kind of have to come up with it. So I'm curious how you did that.
Yeah, there weren't, unfortunately. That was a lot of work. I think Rebecca went, and she picked up things from the historical records that she had access to, and then a lot of what she had access to, I had to go in and I would try to access some archives through the internet, but for the most part I had to use Google, and that was it was kind of it was a real pain, but it was also really interesting. There was this thing that me and Rebecca talk about all the time, which is like so initially I didn't get the script like completed. It was just all piecemeal. There were like parts of the script that were completed and parts that were in process. And so I didn't know what parts of history needed to be, like what historical locations needed to be emphasized or drawn. And so I was just like, everything is important. I'm going to, research and sketch everything. And I spent like weeks trying to figure out how like rope making factories do their work, and like just like looking at like how is rope made and all, and how would have been done, back in the 18th century. And in the end, it was just like one page. So there's a lot. So there's a lot of that. And, I had to look at New York City in the 18th century and then just kind of disseminate from that, like, or distinguish there, like, what was Dutch New York versus like British New York, and what did that look like, and must have had some transition in between, and it's probably stuff that like people will look at the book and be like, oh, I don't know what you're talking about, but that's the stuff that I was like having to like, look into and figure out and just kind of in some ways composite, because some of that imagery didn't exist. I had to like draw like, okay, like here we have this landscape. I'm going to draw some Dutch style houses intermingled with some of these like British style houses. And so, yeah, I don't know. It just Wake jumps all over the timeline. You go to the 18th century to, the 20th century to like different locations to, like including the Dahomey Kingdom. And we go to like Nebraska during the Great Migration. And so there was just, I had like a stack like this big of just like printouts that I had to use to sketch things out. So anyway,
yeah, you really had an incredible range of things you had to depict. I mean, even more so than, Monumental and 80. It's just like you said, because of the time jumps, the global jumps that you were doing, it was an incredible feat. I know, Brian, for Monumental, we had to create basically a digital image library for our illustrator who's not here tonight, Barrington Edwards, who's a remarkable illustrator and teacher up in Boston. But Brian, that was a process. I kind of relate to what Hugo's talking about, stacking, doing all this work to do a single page or a single panel just so you can get that rope right.
It's much easier to do an academic book, and the original manuscript for Monumental started as a regular academic book that would have been written for other historians. So it's over 300 pages, footnotes, and hundreds of newspapers. I believe well over 100 newspapers were used, and countless primary sources from all over the country. But when it came time to actually visualizing a lot of those things, we wanted to be as accurate as possible. So we had to find out which sites were still around, and where possible, actually get sketches of those sites. So we brought in Barrington, and Barrington went to places like the AME Church and the Custom House. So the images look as if, they're real. They were actually done there. It's not an imagined landscape. It's actually taken from newspaper accounts or images or engravings. And that took a lot of time. It took a lot of energy. There was a lot of going back and forth. And where we didn't have we had to do a lot of historical work finding, what would a potbelly stove look like? and how would it have attached to the ceiling? And just minor details. What would the wrought iron fence have looked like outside of the home? How many windows were on the front of his house. So entirely different type of research had to go into it than I normally would do for an academic book, because you're not concerned with visuals. The visuals are taking place in the reader's heads. For the graphic, you have to have both the written word, and then you also have to create the images for the person. So much, much harder. A lot of people ask, well, why'd you do this? Isn't it much, was this like an easy way to get a publication? I'm like, oh, no. And it's, first you have to write the manuscript. So you wrote the book already, and then you have to encapsulate. You can't have a graphic. I guess you could, but I don't know who would buy a 500-page graphic novel. But then you have to try to condense it. And that's where Nick came in. It's like, okay, what don't I need in this manuscript, Nick? And Nick, this is really extraneous. I think the idea that you want to be saying is, I'm going to help you condense this 5 pages into this one scene. And that's very difficult for a historian. Historians are long-winded people.
And Josh, your background as a journalist surely helped you. I mean, you brought this approach. I know you took a lot of photography to help you out, but I'm also remembering some of the scenes in AD where it's like the inside of the grocery store, and I feel like I'm there. You know, I see the
Right.
cans on the shelves and the labels, and I see the frame of the comic book on the wall in the man's room, and I mean, the attention to detail is so loving, and I just can't. Maybe you can talk a little bit about your process of, with it's a contemporary subject, but access is still an issue. We're talking about New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, so maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I just want to say I loved hearing both Hugo and Brian talking about their process, because it's so familiar to me in terms of that sort of feeling of responsibility that you have to get those details right. And Hugo, I don't know about you, but as an artist, I feel like when I have those references and I have, like, you know, resources about what the architecture was like in this period, or what the ropes were made of, or for you guys, I saw a video where you talked about like a fence and a certain kind of pointed quality to that fence, and finding that detail, like, to me, that feeds my imagination and my creativity more than if it was some generic thing where you're drawing a fence, you're drawing a house, you're drawing a car. You know, like when you have these things that are very specific to the region and to the time period that you're depicting, it just helps me as the artist like dive right into that place and feel like I'm there, and I'm looking around and I'm seeing it all, and I can place my characters there and gain even more empathy as a storyteller. So, you know, I identify 1,000% with that, with the agony that goes on as you're creating this work, and kind of like feeling like I'm still not there. I need more, you know? So I was really lucky in the sense that, well, for one thing, I actually volunteered with the Red Cross after Hurricane Katrina. I live up here in Brooklyn, New York. And I was trained as a disaster response worker. And I went down to Biloxi, Mississippi shortly after the hurricane. I worked with survivors down there. So I really did see like the effects of the hurricane in the region, even though obviously, you know, what happened in Biloxi was very different than what happened in New Orleans. But I got a real sense of sort of what that experience was like for people. And I did visit New Orleans just shortly after the water had been pumped out of the streets. And I traveled around like areas that were still barricaded off from people and saw the destruction there. So I really did have a sense of that just, you know, from being in the place. And then because my story was contemporary, I was in touch with all of the characters who were in the book. Like I was, you know, very closely connected with all of them. I was talking to them constantly. I went down to the region, I think 6 or 7 times as I was putting the book together. And you talked about the store. Well, one of the characters, Leo McGovern, he took photos of, he went over to Hamid's store in Central City and took like a whole suite of photos for me of this other character's locale from like every angle.
Wow.
And him being a comic book fan himself, he kind of had a sense of like the angles that I might need, and, you know, different viewpoints and stuff. So, and he was able to send me all of that, you know, great resources, because I wasn't able to actually visit the store at that time. It had been closed and was still being fixed up and stuff. So, and then he also happened to take photos of his apartment right as he evacuated from for the hurricane. And then unfortunately his house was flooded. It got like 3 feet of water and basically destroyed everything that he had. And he took photos of that post flooding as well. So 2 amazing resources to have on hand as I was putting that all together.
You know, there's something Rebecca says a few times in Wake that kind of stuck with me, which is this quote, measured use of historical imagination in order to reconstruct a story. So, you know, this idea where there are gaps in the record, and if you want to tell this story, you're going to have a measured use of historical imagination. And you know, Brian and Josh, especially as writers, you know, can you talk a little bit about the choices you have to make when you're crafting a narrative that can be compelling and dramatic, but that isn't embellishing or stretching the truth of what took place? You know, this is, you are piecing things together that of an incomplete picture. And you know, you have to make some choices in order to make it legible, you know, to a graphic history reader.
Well, with history, you know, we have a standard, so you really can't embellish. You have to have primary sources and secondary sources, so you're actually using these sources as sort of borders that you work within, and you don't have a lot of latitude. So as it goes with creativity, historians generally, I mean, I needed an artist. I needed Barrington to sort of breathe life and into these individuals. Not that I didn't have some idea of what they were like. It's just I needed someone else's frame point. I needed someone else's eye, someone a trained eye who was used to finding the lighter side of things. Because quite often, when I look at Reconstruction, I'm looking at it often as this very, very dark time, as this point of very great possibility that is squandered. And Barrington coming into it as a set of fresh eyes could see the beauty in the city and could see the beauty in certain places. And I love that carries through to the work that he does. Like, my favorite parts of the book are night scenes that he does of the city. I mean, I think the night scenes are quite beautiful, but they also capture the mystique of the city, that someone seeing it for the first or second time, you know, not someone who, like me, that grew up walking up and down Canal Street, seeing it as, you know, okay, this is Canal Street. I mean, there was a sort of whimsy to it that made it extremely special. And that's what I believe, having that, not being the artist, me being able to separate myself and just think about the story and telling the narrative accurately helped a lot. And I think having an artist do his and allowing him to be imaginative within borders, and that there was a lot of tension sometimes. You have to remember, we constructed this during quarantine. So there was Zoom meetings, there were phone meetings, there was back and forth. There was a lot of spreadsheets and sending information back and taking a page, and Nick going, no, you cut through all
Hugo's
of
nodding
this.
his
You get a
head.
lot of red on your book, and you're like, wait a second, you know, you're missing the point. And so there was a lot of tension there that I sort of admire, like, Josh, because he, you know, he kind of did it all there. And but at the same time, this using the collaborative process that we used, I think brought a lot of different talents to the table that I wouldn't have seen. I mean, I personally could not have done the artwork, but even if I could, I don't think I could have seen the city the way Barrington saw the city.
And Josh, you know, it just, you, like Brian said, you wore both hats. You're constructing this narrative, though, from many different perspectives, and that can be, I can imagine, a very difficult process, and just the choices you have to make in terms of how to tell the story, you know, in what order to tell things, what to leave out, what to include. You know, what was that process like?
Yeah, that was quite a process. I mean, I did a ton of research before I ever started, you know, drawing the thing. And actually, the comic was originally serialized in webcomic form on Smith Magazine. And so I also, on top of everything else, I had like this monthly deadline where I had to like churn out a chapter, like do all the writing, reporting, drawing, and everything every month, and then like keep going, like, you know. So, but before it all started, I had all this research. I'd talked to, you know, my characters. I'd identified who was going to be in the piece. You know, I wanted somebody who had stayed behind and sheltered through the storm. I wanted somebody who had lost everything. I wanted someone who had left home and never been able to return because their home had been destroyed. I wanted somebody who hadn't been infected much at all, so who had like that privilege. To sort of be a compare and contrast thing. And I wanted a diversity of backgrounds and races and experiences and genders and all of that stuff. So that was a big part of it, was identifying those threads. And then in terms of like structuring it, I was walking around one day with my wife, who's also a writer, and saying like, I don't know how to enter into this story. Like, so many people's experiences started out similarly and then they diverge, or, there's these gaps in their stories. And I came across this, I was thinking about like a hurricane cloud formation as it's forming, and it's how that it's this spiral form. And I started thinking of like each of the character arcs as one of those spirals, and then they all lead in towards the middle, which is like the heart of the book. And when I had that like visual image, that sort of helped me access how to get into the book. And so that's sort of what I did, is I had each character's strand, kind of interweaving with each other, all coming towards the same point, which is when the storm hits, and then kind of going out again as the storm dissipates and we see the after effects of it. And I made some rules. Like, I was like, okay, I'm not going to use narrative captions. I'm not going to tell anybody anything. It's going to be showing it all. And all the story is going to be told through action and dialogue. And obviously, as a journalist, I felt very strongly that any dialogue that's in word balloons in the book is actual dialogue that was, that I got from either speaking to my people, or from their blogs, or other things that had been written. Some of them had, already been covered in media and stuff as well. So I was able to get it from different sources. And then I just kind of let the story play out that way until about 3/4 of the way into the story, when there's this time jump, after the aftermath of the hurricane. And that at that point I come in as a character in the book, talking as an interlocutor, I guess, for the other characters, sort of like, so where are you now? What's happening? What happened after that? And there's a little more voiceover kind of feeling there. Some of the characters are narrating what happened to them. But it's still told in a very similar way. And there were actually just a couple of places where I felt like I used sort of creative nonfiction techniques to fill in gaps, like you guys are talking about, like things that you just couldn't really know or see. Like there was one time when the sign on Hamid's grocery store was knocked down after the hurricane, and I needed like a transition moment to go from a scene with his store, to a scene with Denise and her apartment as the roof came in. And so I decided, hey, what would happen if that sign was blown off and then was blown all the way down, a major thoroughfare, and passed by Denise's house? Obviously that couldn't have happened, but it was a nice transitional artistic moment.
Quite the visual. And
okay.
and what you're talking about, these artistic choices, I'm going to set Hugo up here with something that you said, Josh, in your afterword, which also struck me, which is, when comics are presented on the web, often one panel at a time, something of the gestalt of the comic book is lost. The interplay of the tiers of images on a page, the way a 2-page spread can work to frame and augment the drama, and aspects of timing, meter, and rhythm, that care definitely comes through in the book as you weave these stories together in such a thoughtful and accessible way. And Hugo, in Wake, just the ways that you used pacing and color, it's black and white, but the contrast and the way that there's shadow and silhouettes, I mean, it felt like it was a sandbox for you visually, in terms of how you were not in 6 squares per page. You really, can you talk about how you used your structure? Brian's laughing, but you just did a really good job in your own way as the illustrator to pace the story and tell it visually.
Man, I don't know. Thanks. Nice compliment to hear. It's hard to be in that framework right now, where I'm just like, oh, this is what I was thinking. But yeah. I think it was very much tied to whatever was happening, and the emotion of what Rebecca was saying in the moment, needed to work well with the visual, and I think, there's just like all these different moments that had to be told in different ways. And I don't know, it's hard. I feel like to me, I don't know, someone was asking me like, what skill did you learn? And I think one of them for me was, just like listening to what the story is trying to say. And I think that that was a really important thing, is just, I had to kind of look at what was, in the script. And, I'd spent some time with Rebecca, so I kind of had an intimate sense of like how she communicates and what she wants to say. And so, it was kind of it was kind of hard trying to kind of navigate what needed to be said, because there's a lot of it that that didn't, the whole story kind of came to me piecemeal. It wasn't just one manuscript that just like, here it is, interpret all of this. And I'm kind of a little bit envious of Josh in that, he kind of had this like master plan of how it's going to like flow. And that's that metaphor of just like the little, just the whatever of the hurricane, the little strands of hurricane as like strands of story. That's just amazing. And I'm like in awe of that foresight. But I think with Wake, it was, I had to take the text and say like, what is going to communicate this in the best way possible in the portion of the story that we're in right now. And that happened in all sorts of ways, where I think, I think me and Rebecca kind of came in a little bit into conflict in this point, where it wasn't really conflict, just like, it was just like, this has got to be shown differently. Maybe I'll show it, but so. Yeah,
let's see.
Rebecca is a professor, and so she, she likes, or she's worked as a professor, and she, likes that part of her identity. And I kind of, didn't want to not include it, but I also felt like it was important to show this part of the story in a way that really, where we could be in the historical moment that we were talking about. And it felt like it really kind of came together well. On the right, I don't know if you can see, I think initially Rebecca wanted to be shown as a professor telling everybody what, this is what's going on. And I'm like, I'm a visual storyteller. We've got to show what is happening. And we've got to, we're going through this like process of depicting how, how colonial law really enforced all of these racist and sexist ideas. And we can't like tell people those things. We have to show those things. And so I had to kind of, really get into what the text wanted to bring out, and bringing it out in a way that can be visually represented, that doesn't take away from the text, but really, reinforces and adds to what the text is saying. But it varies chapter to chapter.
Yeah. I just appreciate the creativity you deployed just in the flow and the rhythm, and what you just said reminded me in terms of like conflict of something, Brian, that happened in Monumental, where I was kind of wearing the hat of editor, and we had an enormous story to tell, but it couldn't be 500 pages long. And so exactly. I remember in your script, the funeral, Oscar Dunn's funeral, I think the whole scene is maybe in terms of text is a page long. There's not much description that goes on there. And when it got into Barrington's hands, he said, hey, this has to breathe. We need to take in the gravity. We need to show all of the different factions of the city that appeared here. We need to have the scale of the 20-some thousand people who came to show up. And so Barrington kind of took it upon himself. He said, just let me do it. I'm going to draw this how I see it. And it ended up being like 7 or 8 pages. And he's like crossing his fingers, right? And we were like, yeah, that's it. That's how it should be, right?
Having grown up here and been like a native and been to, I don't know how many second lines and funerals. I mean, I can quite literally hear the dirge, as the way he drew it. You can almost hear the music that the procession is playing and feel the tones. He did a fantastic job. On the funeral procession. I thought that it was far better than I had envisioned it. But there were a lot of things, like I said, I tell a story and it's very much Dumbatel's, the ice cream fight, right? At the ice cream, a historian tells that, so the mob's outside hotels, people are throwing ice cream. It's not as exciting as it is in a graphic novel. It can't be as exciting as it is in a graphic novel. So you're able to add a whole new gradient. You're able to add a type of texture to the narrative that you couldn't do with just words.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's something that all three of these books did to a degree. And Josh, you've talked about, having the resource of all of the people that you were interviewing. And Hugo, you had Rebecca, and Brian, at the beginning and the end of Monumental, you make an appearance. So what we've done in all three of these books to an extent is we've broken the fourth wall, which is not something you can really do in a traditional text. And I'm curious just how, because all three of the books I think handled it well. Josh, you come in at the end in this closing chapter, this kind of denouement that works really well to me. But can you talk about how you managed to include that? Did you think about treating that differently, or was the plan all along to kind of bring your perspective into it at the end? Because that's a difficult hoop to jump through in order to not interrupt the flow of the story, but it's an opportunity in this format to do something different.
Yeah, again, I got to give credit to Joe Sacco, because as a comics journalist, he always appears in his stories. And, it's actually kind of remarkable. People always talk about it because he draws himself in this really unflattering way. And I've never quite figured out why that is. But one of the things that he does also is he wears glasses, and he draws no pupils in the glasses, like to show that his vision. He's like saying, "I'm here. This was a story filtered through me. I'm the mediator here. So just so you know, there's no such thing as objective truth. Comics should remind you of that anyway, because they're drawn by people. Obviously, they can't fool you into thinking that this is objective reality." And so maybe he's even doubling down on that by taking the pupils out of his eyes to show he's obscured by so many of his own biases. But it's an interesting technique, and he's done it so much and I've read so many of his comics that I just was like, oh yeah, that's a thing you can do. I guess I wasn't thinking about it in a very sophisticated way. I needed at that point to jump forward in time narratively, and because literally the first 120 pages of the book all just happen like that. They happen in a few days' time. So I needed that device, and I needed the characters to now be sort of narrating over their stories in a way that they hadn't been prior. And there was sort of a natural break. And I just put myself in there and said, hey, I showed myself on the phone talking to one of the characters, and then maybe I showed myself one other time. And after that, I just assumed the reader got it, that I was the interlocutor. I like that word. And that I just sort of took it from there. And again, trusted that the readers would come along on the journey, and it wouldn't shock them and they'd throw the book down in anger or something, just keep going.
Yeah. Well, in a way, it's kind of this piece of instruction on how the book is made. And in Hugo, in a way, that's all Wake is a piece of instruction of how this research came together, because it very elegantly traces Rebecca's journey to all of these archives and all these interactions she had. I mean, it's the meta story of this. And so if you see these books as accessible ways to reach this history, also showing the process and the connection that the author has to it, I think can be really special. And of course, Brian, Oscar Dunn being your ancestor, how could we not talk about your experience in your second grade classroom, being told that there was never a Black lieutenant governor? Right. That was kind of the inspiration for so much of your historical work. I'm doing a lot of talking because I want to get in one last thing, and then we do have some questions. But I want to know, and this is going to put you all on the spot. We clearly, from what we've said tonight, this is a very complicated thing to undertake. It is harder than an academic book It is harder, I think, than just about any other kind of book. What's one piece of advice each of you could give to somebody who's never written a piece of graphic nonfiction before, but really wants to give it a shot? Brian, we'll start with you.
If they're a historian, I would say have an idea, a picture in your mind of what you want it to look like. Find an artist that his style matches that picture you had in your mind, and find an editor who can handle the fights that you will inevitably have over how you get, that picture that you
sound more contentious than it ever was.
Work those compromises out. So call Nick Weldon. He's a fantastic editor.
Well, thank you. Hugo, do you have some advice you'd give? Especially from an illustrator's perspective.
Yeah, I think from an illustrator's perspective, it's hard to kind of say. But I think, I think I don't know. I think just having a story that you really resonate with, I think, is the place to start. But that's just such general advice. I don't know if that's helpful. And I think as far as like,
what would you say to an author who comes to you?
That's a good way.
Sorry, I was just going to say, yeah.
I think
an author who wants to work with you, what would you tell them to make your life easier?
I think I don't know. I think, well, I'll just say what worked for me and Rebecca, which was we actually coordinated a lot of work through some consultants who had done work with other academics in the past, and that really kind of, they were able to kind of navigate how they kind of did the job of an editor in a more intimate way, where they were working with me as an artist and they were working with Rebecca as an author, where they were like, this is a lot more text than can actually work in a visual medium. And then they would come to me and be like, okay, like, here's the text. And then they would be like, actually, that does not work with the text that we're talking about, so I think it's important to find ways to kind of navigate just those distinctions, or those career differences. I think like a historian has such a different point of view, and they want to say a lot. I think for me, sometimes it was hard to say as much as Rebecca wanted me to say in one page. I think there were times when I would look at the script and be like, this cannot be one page. There's way too much information. And so I would like break it up, I'd be like, okay, like this needs to be, paced out a little bit more because there's a lot of information going in. And there were times when the opposite would happen. There's, where it's just like, I can just condense this so easily just by giving context clues of what's around, or, just giving, just different types of, trying to say the things without words, and I think being in that.
I was just thinking of the book on the table, even like the Booker T. Washington book sitting on the table of her grandfather, just something that says so much without saying anything,
Right.
I'm sure that was a choice you made that was like part expediency of narrative, but
that was actually Rebecca's choice. That was her idea. I think like, I also think like, authors or historians shouldn't sell themselves short as being people that can communicate through a visual medium. I think Rebecca had a lot of really amazing ideas about how to like tell the story. And it was a real privilege to just be able to execute those things with her. And I think, I think we all interact with different types of media, and we have some kind of awareness and what's forgetting the word that this anyway, we all just have some sort of exposure to all sorts of media, and so we have something to say on it, and so I think like an author or historian shouldn't sell themselves short as not being a fully visual person, other people can maybe like do the work better. But I think the input of an author on what should be visually communicated is super important and special. And it gives life to the book ultimately.
And Josh, as somebody who's worn both hats, a word of advice for somebody new to this.
Well, one of the first sort of assignments that I give students in my comics classes, and I work with both artists who already feel confident as cartoonists, but also people who've never made a comic before in their life, is I show them this comic by Harvey Picard and Robert Crumb called The Harvey Picard Name Story, which is just this 4-page, really simple comic by Harvey Picard, creator of American Splendor, about the origin of his name. And it's this very, very simple, regimented comic, which is basically just like a headshot of a guy standing in front of the camera and not moving at all, almost like a stand-up comedian in front of a brick wall sort of concept. And it all just works on timing and like silent panels and just subtle facial expressions. And I give them this assignment: write a 12-panel comic about your own name and do it in the same, style, or break off from it if you feel like, inspired. And most people, even if they've never really drawn much, they at least feel like they can draw like an iconic self-portrait, like a very simple schematic self-portrait. And they have to think about, when you start thinking about the origins of your name, it's inevitably fascinating. And it gets into family history and being teased as kids and feeling like an outsider and being too generic. I mean, there's just so many different ways it can go. I have like this series of prompts for them to get them thinking about these questions in ways that they maybe haven't for a while. And then they have to think about how to space it out and not have too many words in every panel, as Hugo is talking about. Just do that story and get that experience under their belt. It's like short, it's 1 page, it's not too intimidating, but they learn a lot from it, and it sort of opens a lot of doors, or tells people, okay, this form is way too complicated for me. But most of the time it's not that. Most of the time they're encouraged and excited and want to try some more, And I guess the thing I always tell writers who want to collaborate with me is first, read Understanding Comics, and second, think like an artist. Like as you're writing a scene, like think, how would you want this to be visualized, and what's really possible in what you're imagining. And even if you can't draw at all, you have to love comics if you're making a comic. So I think that always helps a bit too.
Well, Josh, that's a great note. We don't have a ton of time for questions, but we'll open it up here. I just want to thank the three of you for your time sharing tonight. This has been really illuminating, just all the different perspectives that we have here. So Megan, Candace, if you want to jump in and fire away with the time we have left here, go for it. Could you talk more about your collaboration process between authors and artists? What does the back and forth look like? I'll open that to anybody who wants to respond to it.
Well, the back and forth for Monumental was really a 3-way. So there was the artist, the editor, and myself. A lot of it, and it took place in more than one medium. Sometimes we were on the phone, sometimes we were on Zoom. We created spreadsheets. We often had Google Share Drives to share images, to share documents, to share anything that might elaborate and provide more detail on something that we want to visualize. So, and it was almost constant. So we all got to know each other really well. We got to know about each other's families. We during the little over a year it took to really, when we really started getting down and dirty with it during COVID, most of us didn't have anywhere to go anyway. So, we could immerse ourselves in this sort of project. And we became pretty good friends because of that. So that's my story.
Either
Hugo,
you
you
want
go
to
ahead.
jump? Yeah.
I do want to hear Josh's.
Yeah, I talked to myself in the shower.
I mean, I think, I'd be in. It sounds interesting. But I think with me and Rebecca, it was very similar to Brian's process, where we did have a Google Drive. This was not during the pandemic, but we were, Rebecca lives in Utah, I live in New Orleans, and we had to do long distance conversations all the time, and we do a lot of email exchanges and stuff. I think the process was very much like Rebecca is writing, and I'm doing sketching based on the chapters that I got. But there was also a lot of pre-production work that had to be done. So, before the script was completed, I was doing a lot of, that historical research that we were talking about. There's also, I had like a little bit of documentation. I had like pictures of Rebecca, where, so I got to spend a little bit of time with her in New York and take pictures and kind of get a sense of what that like the city was like. I mean, I've been a few times before, but, I got to kind of get a sense of what New York looks like through Rebecca's eyes. And that was really insightful. And then there's the process of storyboarding. And so just a lot of storyboarding on my end and that could be kind of, I don't know, it could be kind of hard because you have, really complex ideas being expressed. And so, there were times when the ideas were so complicated, we had to do it like 5 or 6 different times, and each time, each time you learn something about what needs to be taken away and what needs to be expressed in that chapter or in that sequence of pages. And so, I think part of it is like, you have to be patient with the process. In the end, some of those pages that like just really like were overwrought just, came out as like really like pages that really stood out, that really like, that really had a dense meaning to them. And I think, I think being open to that process and letting yourself get a little bit frustrated or a lot frustrated with it, but being patient with that frustration, I think is really important. Especially, I don't know. I feel like that's what worked for me and Rebecca, is just like patience with the process and being in sincere and caring dialogue about those things.
Yeah, definitely. And I know with Monumental, we had to, it was kind of, the work for Brian was harder in the beginning, and then it was harder for Barrington in the end, because we worked so hard to get the script in shape so that we weren't throwing a bunch of curveballs to Barrington once he started his process. Because I'm Hugo and Josh, like the idea of having to like redraw something because somebody's rewritten, this section of the script, like you really have to get your words down before you turn it loose on an illustrator. And so that was really important for us. Sorry, Josh, I didn't mean to jump in, but I want to hear what you have to say, and then we have another question we'll take.
Yeah, I'll just go fast. I mean, obviously the collaboration process is a little different when you're doing it yourself, except that I'm this weird guy that actually like writes out a full script for myself to draw. So it is a little bit of a feeling of like wearing 2 different hats, and sometimes my 2 hats being in conflict with each other. Like there are things that I really want to say that just don't really fit when I start drawing them, and then there are things that I can't draw as well as I imagined, from the writer side of myself, and that's very frustrating. But so I write out these scripts, and then I do these like little teeny tiny thumbnail sort of pre-visualizations, and then I just go from there. And there's always a little shifting and finding efficiencies in the storytelling that happen in that process. But actually, I have to say that I ended up collaborating very closely with one of the characters in the book, Denise, who's one of the central characters in the story, who is she stayed behind after the hurricane, and then ended up being sent to the convention center and saw what happened there, and sort of refuted a lot of the prevailing narratives that came out after the hurricane. And when I first started drawing her, you know, as I told you guys, I was doing it in a serialized way. So the first time she appeared in the comic and she was reading it in real time, she kind of had issues with the way I had portrayed her. She felt like I came across that I portrayed her in her words as a stereotypical black bitch. And, you know, like there was no way for her to know what was in my heart. Like we only knew each other, you know, in a sort of a interrogator, you know, witness sort of fashion up to that point. And she talked to me about it, expressed her concerns, you know, about the way that she was going to be portrayed. And I was really taken aback by that, because I had good intentions, but I could see from her perspective that, you know, she didn't know how it was going to all turn out. So I made a deal with her that from that point forward, I would show her my scripts of any scenes that she was going to be in. And, you know, that's kind of a no-no from a journalistic perspective traditionally, but since I wasn't writing a story that was like a gotcha piece or something where I was trying to, like, you know, trash her or anything like that, it was the opposite. I was really happy to have her direct connection to it and to vet the script in a sense. And she ended up really helping me with details of dialogue and dialect and clothing and all sorts of stuff. And actually never censored anything. You know, she just augmented and improved things that I was planning on doing and remembered more details. And it became this amazing creative partnership for those scenes just with her. So I was really grateful for that.
Yeah, that's a really cool development. What do we have next? Questions. All right. So the question. Thank you for this question here. Do you all have any tips for very young comic artists, or maybe an exercise you wish you would have been given to try in elementary school? Tips for young artists.
I'll jump in real quick. I use an exercise that Ivan Brunetti, the cartoonist and comics teacher, sort of came up with, which is this 3-minute, 1-minute, 30-second, 10-second exercise, which is all about like helping you visualize like how comics are about boiling down things to their essence and kind of just like finding ways to be as reductive as possible in the drawing to get your point across. And so the basic premise of it is I have kids break up a piece of paper into like fold a piece of paper into 4 squares, and then in the first square I have them draw a self-portrait or a car, either one. And they have to draw that for 3 minutes, and they're not allowed to stop drawing, and they can add as much detail as they want and all this other stuff. And then I have them draw the same exact thing, but this time they only have a minute to do it. So they now, even if they're copying the other drawing, they're kind of like finding more effective and more like each line becomes more important, I guess is a way to say it. And then they have to do the same thing in 30 seconds and then in 10 seconds. And it's a really fun exercise because it really lowers everybody's sense of like needing to be a perfectionist, and everybody's work sort of becomes the same. The talented artist's work by the end looks the same as the artists who are really you know, tentative and insecure. And I think you learn a lot of lessons about like sort of the language of comics, and it's just kind of a fun group exercise that everyone ends up laughing at the end, which is, you know, the best kinds of ways to learn.
I don't know if Hugo or Brian have any advice. I know one thing I've taught a little bit of this to younger audiences, and it kind of a similar format, but just in terms of the utility of just taking a single sheet of paper, and there's a way you can kind of fold it into 8 little panels, and just the idea that you don't need fancy materials or a lot of skill to be able to just kind of put together 8 little squares and construct like an autobiographical story, or just, you know, something that happened in school that day. But just like with a single sheet of paper, you fold it into 8 squares and kind of cut it in the middle. It's hard to describe with my voice, but it's yeah, just taking something simple and breaking it down and just seeing where their creativity flows.
For me, I would probably say hone your craft. Practice every day, a little bit at a time, and try to get better at very basic skills.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'm being told our time is up. So I want to thank all three of you for your time this evening. I want to thank everybody in the audience on behalf of the Words and Music Festival, the Historic New Orleans Collection. Thanks for your time, and thank you, Megan, for inviting us all to be here. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you
Thanks,
all.
everyone.
This is
Good meeting everybody.
so exciting. I'm really looking forward to this next session, which will start in 18 minutes, and we'll continue the conversation about history. We have a panel of historians talking about teaching historical research methods to incarcerated women. And next year, the women that they are teaching this to will be here at Words and Music to present their research. So come back in 18 minutes for the first of a 2-year session. I will see you soon, and thank you again. And don't forget to pop into the virtual festival bookstore and pick up a copy of all 3 of these books. We'll see you soon. Bye.